Obrigada very much for this invitation to this important conference, and also for this, my first visit to your spectacular country. I'm going to tell you some results of the research that we have done in my lab and over the past few years, which will eventually lead, after a few minutes, to some suggestions on this topic of how we should mitigate the road effects on wildlife populations. I'm underlining the word populations because I think it is populations that we are worried about with roads. We're worried about the possible effects of roads on the persistence, the chance of survival of populations of wildlife. Do I point this? Okay. A few years ago, a student in my lab, Trina Ritwinski, and I did a review of the literature of the effects of roads on wildlife populations. There were three types of studies at the population level. The first type of study looks at the abundance, the number of animals near roads with low traffic versus roads with high traffic. The second type of study looks at the abundance, number of animals with increasing distance away from roads. The third type of study looks at a larger scale, how many animals are there in the landscape and how are they distributed with respect to roads. Are there fewer animals in places with more roads? Altogether, we found 79 studies. Most of these were done within the last 10 years. These include many different species groups, and all different trophic levels. And they've been done all over the place, except we didn't find anything at the population level in South America at that time. And in different habitats. This shows you an example of the various species. Not all of them, but it shows you some of the species for which people have found negative effects of roads on the population level. Altogether, most of the studies did show negative effects, but there were quite a few studies that showed no effect, and a few studies showing positive effects of roads. But most of them show negative effects on populations. And there were three groups in particular that almost always show negative effects of roads on populations. Those are the amphibians, the reptiles, and the larger mammals. So in this rest of this presentation, I'm just now going to show you the outline of the presentation. So first, I will talk about what do we mean by population level mitigation. Next, I will explain why I think it's important to understand the mechanism by which roads affect populations in order to design mitigation. Then I will talk about the relative importance of mortality effects versus barrier effects on populations. Then I will talk about the relative effects of mortality versus traffic noise effects. Then I will lead from that into what types of species are most in need of mitigation. And then finally, some ideas about how best to mitigate effects of roads. First, what is population level mitigation? If we just think about it at the population level, we have population over time fluctuating up and down, and then we have a road put in place. What happens to the population? Well, if there's no mitigation, the population might go down over time if it is a sensitive species, sensitive to road effects. If a mitigation is put in place, we might have what we might call partial mitigation, so the population doesn't go down as much as without the mitigation, but it still goes down. And if we have full mitigation, then we can say that the population just keeps fluctuating along as it would have without the road in place. So that's what we mean by mitigation at the population level. So now, why do we need to understand the mechanisms by which roads affect populations? So we have different mechanisms, and the different mechanisms imply different mitigations. That's the reason we need to understand the mechanism. For example, if the mechanism works, that way? Okay. Okay. Maybe at the door. So the first mechanism is mortality. If the main mechanism affecting populations is mortality, then the mitigation is potentially something like we need to have something to keep the animals from going on the road, from getting killed. Another mechanism is the movement barrier effect of roads. This could affect populations by limiting access to resources, also by reducing the possibility of an area that has undergone a local extinction from being recolonized. So this is the barrier effect. So if the barrier effect is the main mechanism, then we might need to build something to allow the animals to cross the road. If noise disturbance is the main mechanism, then that implies we should do something. Well, for noise disturbance, I should mention this is the mechanism that most people suggest is the reason for road effects on birds, because they need to communicate by singing, and that can become disturbed by the noise of the traffic. And also some people have suggested that this may be a problem for amphibians, for frogs that sing, also to attract mates. So this could reduce the reproductive rate of birds or amphibians. So if this is the problem with the roads, then we want to do something to reduce the effect of noise. So noise barriers or some kind of engineering solution to the noise effect. So to figure out which is the best place to start with mitigation, all of these effects can happen, but the question is, which one is the most important? So where should we start? Where should we begin with our mitigation? What's the most important place to start with mitigation? So we need to understand the mechanism. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about some studies in my lab looking at the relative effects of mortality and barrier effects. Starting with a simulation model done by a former postdoc in my lab, Jochen Jäger. Jochen did a simple simulation model of a population in an area with two patches, patch 1, patch 2. The animals could die, they could reproduce, and they could move. And if they moved towards the road, they might turn back if there was a strong barrier effect. They might try to cross the road and die if there was high mortality, or sometimes they might actually succeed in crossing the road. So here you can see one simulation run with the population in each of the two patches, patch 1, patch 2. So the populations fluctuate over time, and what I've shown here is the fact that sometimes the population in one patch would go extinct, and then when it comes back here, because there's been movement from the other side of the road, so recolonization. So movement is important in this model. However, overall, for more than 82% of the different combinations of parameters that y'all can try, it turned out that mortality was more important than the barrier effect in terms of the effect on the population. So that's a simulation model, and of course nobody ever believes a simulation model. So what do we do to test this idea? How do we do an empirical test of the relative importance of movement, barrier, and mortality on populations? So what we need to do is compare different species, the effects of roads on different species, some species that avoid going on roads, so they have a strong barrier effect, and other species that don't avoid going on roads, so they might have high mortality. And if we can hypothesize that if movement, the movement barrier, is more important than mortality as the mechanism causing the road effect, that the relationship between animal abundance and road density for the species that avoids the road should be steeper, should be more negative than the relationship for the animals that don't avoid the roads and get killed. Alternatively, if mortality is more important than the movement barrier in affecting the wildlife population, then this slope here should be steeper for the species that don't avoid the road and get killed on the road than for the species that avoid the road and have the barrier effect. So we need information about road avoidance for different species and also information about abundance of those species relative to road density. Beginning with road avoidance, I would first point out how not to measure road avoidance. So when you see a study like this, a lot of times people will say that shows the animals are avoiding the roads. But you can have the same pattern caused by road mortality, or by road avoidance, the movement barrier, or by traffic or noise disturbance. So this type of study does not tell us about road avoidance. We have to look at the behavior of the animals when they are trying to cross or thinking of crossing the road. So we have a comparison between two small animals, one mouse and one frog. For the mouse, I have a student, Rochelle McGregor, who did a study where she captured the mice, at different study sites with different numbers of roads around the forest ranges. She captured the mice and she translocated them, she moved them across different numbers of roads. And she had 197 mice, and she looked at whether or not they came back to the site where they were caught. And she found that there was a 50% decrease in the probability of a mouse coming back for each additional road between the home and the release point of the mouse, after correcting for distance effects. So the mice show strong road avoidance, and we never had any mice that we know of killed on any of the roads. On the other hand, for the leopard frog, I had a student, Julie Bouchard, who did a study where she captured frogs during the spring migration, and she released them near roads with water on the other side of the road, so they're interested in moving across the road. And she looked at the effect of traffic level on the road And also she released some in locations where there were no roads. And she found that all the frogs that she released tried to cross the road. So they had no avoidance of the road. And even though these were not very busy roads, 30% of those frogs got killed by the cars. So we have two species. We have the mouse, which avoids roads, so it has a barrier effect of the road. And we have the frog, which does not avoid roads, so it has a mortality effect of the roads. So now we need to ask, which one has the stronger effect at the population level of road density? So we need information about abundance versus road density for the frog and the mouse. So my student Trina Ritwinski did a study looking at the abundance of mice, white-footed, the same species of mouse, which is a forest species. She estimated the abundance, relative abundance of this mouse in forest patches, in the center of forest patches, in 14 landscapes. So these are landscapes, now you see the result. Okay, so these are landscapes that are 2 kilometers in radius, and she selected 7 landscapes with low road density. She studied the mouse in the middle, of the mouse populations in the middle, and 7 landscapes with high road densities. And she found the opposite of our prediction, which is that the mouse populations were actually higher in the forest patches, in the landscapes with high road density in the surroundings. For the frog, we have a couple of studies. I'll just show you one here. It's a similar design. We have different ponds around our region, the Ottawa region, and these are in locations with different road densities in the surrounding area. And for the frogs, we find that there is a negative effect of the density of roads in the surrounding area on the abundance of frogs in a wetland in the center of that landscape. So we have the frog, which does not avoid the road. We have the mouse, which does avoid the road. So the mouse is the barrier, the frog is the mortality. And we have the mouse showing at least no effect of road density or even a positive effect. And we have the frog showing a negative effect. So this comparison supports, for this pair of species, the prediction that mortality is more important than the barrier effect in determining the effect of roads on the population. And I think it's more general, at least for these groups, than just these 2 species, because if you remember, one of the groups with negative road effects in general is the amphibians, and then if you look at the small mammals, they're either in the positive effect or no effect. So this is all of the studies that had been done up until, almost all of the studies that had been done up until we did this review. So it seems that, and there are other studies, which you may hear more about on small mammals, where showing that small mammals often avoid going onto roads. And so I think it's probably a generalization that we can make between these 2 groups. So what this suggests is that if the relative effect of mortality is higher than the effect of the barrier, then we should be focusing more on mitigation for mortality than on mitigation for reducing the barrier effect. Some of you biologists in the crowd are thinking about genetics, and because often we get this question, okay, but over the long term, the genetic diversity of the population will go down if you have a barrier in the landscape. And this might affect the probability of a population surviving over time. So that would increase the barrier effect. So to look at this, a very first a glimpse at this, a postdoc in my lab named Nathan Jackson just completed a simulation study, a genetic simulation study, looking at the relative effects of mortality and barrier. So in the model, you go from a situation with no road to a situation with a road. And in this case, roads reduce genetic variability by increasing genetic drift. And this happens for two reasons. One is that the population size is reduced. So that increases genetic drift and reduces variability. And that's a mortality effect. And the other is that we're dividing the population into smaller populations and reducing genetic exchange between populations. And that also will increase drift and reduce genetic variability. So the question again is, which effect is more important, the mortality or the barrier effect? In this simulation, what Nathan found was that the mortality explains 81 to 99% of the reduction in genetic variability, while the barrier effect explained only less than 1% of the reduction in genetic variability. So again, it seems to support, this is just a simulation again, but it seems to support the conclusion that the mortality effect is stronger than the barrier effect on genetic diversity as well as population abundance. Okay, so that's the relative importance of mortality and barrier effects. Moving to the relative importance of mortality and traffic noise. Often the traffic noise is, as I said before, used to explain this type of pattern which we commonly see, where the abundance or the species richness of birds becomes reduced near roads, and this reduction is increased with increasing traffic. So the question is this actually an effect of noise, or could it actually be an effect of mortality of the birds? So a student of mine, Patty Summers, did a study. She selected 10 sites, high traffic sites, where she surveyed birds in the forest, in transects away from the roads, I should say. And she also recorded the noise from the traffic at each time that she surveyed the birds. And what she found is that, as expected, traffic noise goes down with distance from the road, and bird numbers go up with distance from the road. So lots of people have found that same result. But she found some things that suggest that it's not actually the noise that's causing this reduction in birds near the roads. First, the distance at which traffic noise was reached its minimum was 450 meters from the road, but for the birds, they reached their maximum at 350 meters, so not the same distance. Also, the effect of distance on the birds was much stronger than the effect of noise. So noise and distance are correlated with each other, but the effect of distance was stronger than the effect of noise. Most important is, because she had 10 sites, she could actually control for distance and ask if there's an effect of noise after you control for the effect of distance. And there's no effect of noise after you control for the effect of distance. So this suggests, at least, that even though birds do show a strong negative response to roads, this is something due to something other than noise, and our current hypothesis is mortality, and I have a student who's planning to test that in a couple of ways, so I don't have that result. The other group of species, as I mentioned, is the amphibians, which use song. The other group of species for which noise might be an effect is amphibians, which the frogs, at least frogs and toads, anurans, they use song to attract mates, males. And I had a student, Glenn Cunnington, who did a couple of studies. First, he started by looking at the song characteristics of frogs in ponds where there's a lot of traffic noise and ponds where there's less traffic noise. So he had quiet sites, so ponds with low traffic noise. He had what we call treatment sites. So these are quiet sites where he blasted noise, traffic noise. He played traffic noise at the site, and he continued to record the frog calls. And then he had sites that were already noisy because they're near roads. So what he found was that two species, green frog and gray tree frog, altered their calls, the characteristics of their mating calls, in response to traffic noise. And the third species, American toad, did not alter its call. So then what Glenn did is he used these recordings of the frog calls to try to attract females to traps in ponds, and he had recordings that were made with traffic noise present and without traffic noise present, and he played those recordings at ponds where there was traffic noise or where there was no traffic noise to try to attract the females. So he had 4 combinations of male songs that were made with traffic noise, played at ponds to try to attract females, at ponds where there was traffic noise, and all 4 combinations of those 2 things. So what did he find? So for the 2 species that alter their calls, when he played male calls made in a quiet site, when he played them at a pond with a trap, but where there was a lot of noise, they were not good at attracting females. However, when he played those calls that were made at noisy sites, when he played those calls at ponds with traffic noise, then he caught a lot of females. The traps caught a lot of females. Just as many females as just as many females as in the situation where you had the sort of natural situation with the calls made in a quiet site and played in a quiet site. So the frogs were adjusting their call successfully to attract the females. For the American toad, which did not adjust its call, there was no difference between its ability to attract females in the different situations. So, again, the negative effects of roads on frogs, which are well documented at the population level, are not due to noise, generally speaking. They seem to be due probably mostly to road mortality. Okay, so that's, going back to this review, that's the amphibians and the birds don't seem to be, the birds I'm sure I would get more debate about, but they seem to be not actually responding to traffic noise. We think also probably the reptiles, but I don't think anybody's directly studied the reptiles, whether they actually respond to traffic noise or not, but at the population level. But I suspect that the reptile effect is also an effect of mortality. For the larger mammals, however, there are some studies that do show a disturbance effect of, and possibly due to the noise, of roads. For example, these 3 species, it has been shown by other researchers that traffic noise is a contributing factor to the negative road effects on these species at the population level. However, we can't extrapolate this to all large mammals because there are some studies that have looked at the relative effects of different factors on large mammal populations, and for some species, for example the black bear and the Florida panther, it has been shown that mortality is the main effect of roads on those populations. Okay, so it seems that the relative effect of mortality and traffic noise is that the mortality has a stronger effect in general than the traffic noise. So going back again to this picture, at least to start with, as a first approach to mitigation, we should probably focus more on the mortality effect than on the barrier effect or the noise effect. Okay, so moving to the next kind of last part of the talk, which is more about mitigation. Which types of species are most in need of mitigation? All right, so we start with the statement, which you may have to believe me, that population level effects of roads are mainly caused by mortality. So if that is true, then it means that mitigation is most needed for species that are susceptible to road mortality. So what does that mean? That means slow-moving species that don't avoid the roads and also don't avoid a car when it's coming at it. So that would be the amphibians and many of the reptiles as well. But for the reptiles, some of them are actually attracted to roads. For example, in our area we have turtle species that are attracted to roads as a place next to the road to lay their eggs. So they have their nest next to the road in the soft shoulder of the road, and the females get killed and also the babies get killed on the road. So slow-moving species that are actually attracted to roads and which are not able to avoid cars also are going to be susceptible to mortality. This one is just a hypothesis at this point, but it seems like a pretty easy hypothesis to be tested, so I'm hoping it will be tested soon, maybe here in Brazil, that for birds, it should be the species that fly close to the ground that are most affected by roads, since they will be the species that are most affected by road mortality. And then for mammals, it's the species, it's the larger mammals, and we hypothesized that this is because larger mammals have lower reproductive rates, so they are less able to rebound. The populations are less able to recover from road mortality. And also, they move around the landscape more, so they're interacting all the time with roads much more frequently. So the probability of the animal getting killed is going up because the frequency of its interaction with the road is high, with roads is high. And for this last one, my student Trina Ritwinski tested this idea by doing a cross-species comparison of the effect of road density across all the mammals that she could study in our area. So she studied mammals in 54 landscapes, which ranged in road density, but they were similar in terms of urban development and also in terms of the amount of forest, so we controlled for those factors. And in each landscape, she put several devices for surveying footprints of mammals for 13 mammal species, ranging in size, and she did put these in the center of the different landscapes. So these are just some photos of the devices, and in each case she was surveying the mammals by attracting them to some kind of device, either a tube or a box or a covering, depending on if the animal likes open areas or closed areas, and putting carbon on the surface and allowing them to walk there and leave their footprints. So in this picture you can see some photographs that she did with infrared camera at night because she wanted to verify the footprints that she was getting. So here you can see a fisher, that's a predator in our area, and this is a raccoon, and these are their footprints. So in this figure, each data point is one species, and each data point is the relationship, if you think of it as the slope of the relationship between the abundance of that species and the density of roads. So a negative, but it's been transformed. So these values down here show a strong negative effect of roads, and these values, these values up here show a positive effect of roads. So the mouse I showed you before would be up here. So what she found was that yes, mammals with lower reproductive rates had more negative effects of roads, a stronger negative effect of roads for the animals with lower reproductive rates, so the mammals that are less able to rebound from road effects. That was the strongest effect. She also found, in addition to that, the predicted negative effect of movement range, but this was in the form of an effect of body size. So larger mammals showed more negative road effects. Larger mammals move farther, so we think this is actually an effect of the mobility of these larger mammals. And between the two of these variables, the reproductive rate was more important, a stronger effect, but the body size was also a significant additional effect. And between the two of those effects, the multiple regression explains 77% of the variation in the slope of the relationship between abundance of the animals and the density of roads. So that supports the idea that large animals with low reproductive rates and wide movement ranges are more affected by roads. So that's the kinds of species most in need of mitigation then are the species that do not avoid roads or cars, especially the ones that are attracted to the roads, so that's the amphibians and the reptiles. Ones that move, we're hypothesizing for the birds, it's the ones that move low to the ground. And for the mammals, it's the larger mammals with low reproductive rates and wide movement ranges. Okay, so then what should we do about mitigation? So the first objective, remembering that all of the mechanisms can play a role, but the first objective should be to reduce or eliminate road mortality. And the focus, as I've just mentioned, should be on, initially at least, amphibians, reptiles, and large mammals. It remains to be seen whether this holds in the tropics. So, what I'm proposing here is that there's kind of a hierarchy in effectiveness of possible mitigation strategies. This is at a very general level. I'm not an engineer. I'm not going to talk about specific designs, but just general strategies. And I'm ranking them here in decreasing order of effectiveness for reducing road mortality. So the first one is regional planning. And this is something that as road ecologists we often focus down on the road instead of thinking back about the regional situation. So regional planning, and the first and most obvious one has to be stated, but of course it's going to be the least practical, and that is going to be to reduce the number of roads. Obviously, if we have fewer roads, we have less road effect. And any road has an ecological effect, so if we reduce the number of roads, we reduce the road effect. That's usually not considered practical. So the next best thing we could do is to reduce the traffic that's on the roads, because most of the effect of roads is due to the traffic that's on them. So I've drawn this as an example. You could have more public transportation that would maybe reduce the traffic on roads. But some way to reduce traffic on roads. Because, as I said, the traffic is the main effect of the road. Also, we could think about where to apply these ideas. And we should probably apply these planning ideas near places where we have high biodiversity. So here I've shown a wetland, and we could reduce the quality of a road near the wetland, which would reduce the traffic on it, or we could put public transportation along the roads that are going near the wetland. So we reduce the traffic volume in the most sensitive parts of the landscape. Another point is that when we need to increase traffic capacity from one location to another, rather than building a new road, we should try to increase the traffic on existing roads. The reason for that is that road effects are not linear with traffic. So you have, if you think about mortality, the probability of mortality will reach a maximum with traffic, and so once you increase the traffic beyond that, you have no additional effect of traffic. And it's the same thing with the distance of the road effect away from the affected. So this is not a very popular one because, first of all, land is cheaper, at least in Canada, if there are no people there. So governments like to build roads where there are no people, but of course that's where all the wildlife and all the biodiversity is. So any of these would take a lot of political will, but this is a regional planning strategy to reduce the effects of roads. Okay, so that's regional planning, which I think is actually the most effective way to reduce road effects. Then when we get to actually, the structure, the roads themselves, the second most important thing to do is to put in place measures to keep animals off the roads. If the main effect of roads is mortality, we need to keep animals from going on the roads and getting killed. So how do we do that? Well, obviously fencing is the main thing that people will think about. So here we have fencing in the bottom for frogs, and in this figure, fencing for turtles. We also have fencing that's built for larger mammals, such as here koalas and wolves. Fencing is, of course, has its drawbacks. It has to be very well installed. It has to be buried so that nothing can go underneath the fencing. And it has to be well maintained so that we don't have holes in the fencing, which makes it useless. When the animals go onto the road and get trapped, then that's almost worse for them. And also it has to be long, very long, like the whole road. Because if you put up fencing, you tend to get mortality spots where the fencing ends. So those are all, of course, expenses. The expense of putting in the appropriate fencing for all different kinds of species that are susceptible, the amphibians, the reptiles, and the larger mammals. Plus, it has to be buried, it has to be tall enough for those animals, it has to be small enough grill, and it has to be long enough, and it has to be maintained. So, it's not cheap. What did I do? Okay, so, and then the other thing is it's not actually going to work for everything. There will be species like some small snakes and salamanders which are negatively affected by road mortality, for which fencing is very difficult to find, a fence that would actually keep them off the roads. So for species like that, what has worked quite well is what I'm calling the wall with a lip. So here you can see there's the road, and this is a wall which has a lip here, and this one has a lip here. And what happens is for these types of animals, for amphibians and reptiles, if they come and get up to this road, even if they can climb the wall, they don't want to go upside down under the lip. So they don't go on the road. So this is a very effective way to keep animals off the road, small animals that are terrestrial, small terrestrial animals. However, you would also need fencing because this will not be good, effective really for larger mammals. So it's all not cheap. Okay, so what about wildlife passages? Do wildlife passages reduce mortality? So remembering that mortality is the main effect of roads, and this is what we're after now, is reducing the main effect. So here's what we know about wildlife passage effectiveness. We know that animals use them. We actually more accurately know that some animals use some of them sometimes. But do they actually reduce road mortality? That is something that has not been looked at very often. So I had my student Glenn Cunnington who looked at this question. He used 20 culverts and along a road. I'll show you the picture in a minute, but he had two predictions. One was that if culverts as underpasses reduce mortality of amphibians, of frogs and toads, then when you put a grate across the culvert, the mortality on the road should go up after. And likewise, if fencing is important, then if you put fencing along the road up to the underpass, then the mortality on the road should go down. So he had 20 culverts that were all very similar along this stretch of road which goes along the St. Lawrence River here. And he had 10 control sites. He had 4 sites where he put the fencing along both sides of the road going to the culverts. And he had 6 sites where he put the grates across the culvert openings. And he had roadkill surveys, so counts of road-killed frogs and toads. He had those counts before all of this was put in place, and then after it was put in place. And what he found, actually I missed, there's actually 2009 and 2010 data now, but they show the same thing. What he found is that the fencing had a huge effect. So this is before versus after for the fencing, versus here's the controls. The controls were a little bit lower mortality, but this is a much, much bigger effect than this reduction in the controls. The grates showed, showed no change in mortality, the sites where he had the grates across the culverts. Compared to the culverts, the control culverts, there was a slight increase if you compare this change to this change, but it was not statistically significant, it was very small. So what that suggests is that, in fact, underpasses, for this one study at least, do not actually reduce the mortality. What's reducing the mortality when you have an underpass is the fence that goes with it, keeping the animals off the roads. Okay, so, however, there's a lot of talk about underpasses and overpasses. So, option 3, which I'm suggesting is actually probably the least effective, would be to think about strategic placement of wildlife passages to reduce mortality. So this is a hypothesis, and it's quite simple, which is that many animals move along streams naturally. I'm thinking maybe also in the tropics. And what that means is that we have roadkill hotspots wherever streams intersect roads. So the animals are moving along the stream, they come to a road, they try to cross the road, they get killed. So those are the roadkill hotspots. And this is what it usually looks like around our area when the animal comes up to the road. He usually finds this type of culvert, and he doesn't want to go in there, so he goes on the road and he gets killed. So the suggestion is just at stream crossings, even small stream crossings, we should make the stream look like a stream under the road. We should just make it stay as a stream. So it's a combination of this and plus this. So it should look normal, like a normal stream, but it should also have wide banks on either side for the terrestrial species. And then when an animal comes along the stream, he's walking along the stream, and he comes to the road, he doesn't notice the road, just keeps going under the stream, under the road, and he doesn't get killed. So that's the hypothesis for strategic placement. But of course, to what extent, the question is, to what extent would doing this actually reduce the population level effects of roads? So if you put in place these extended crossings, natural crossings, if you put these in place, would you get the same decline in the population? Would you get some partial reduction in the population decline? Or would you actually get a full mitigation so there's no decline in the population? So that's not actually known. And it's not known because it's very hard to do these kinds of tests, population level tests. And this is the sort of ideal that we want to have done at some point. There's at least one study like this, but for the road and not for mitigation of a road. So what we want to have is a study where, in advance of the road construction, we have a whole bunch of potential crossing sites, all the stream crossing sites, and we monitor the population, and then we randomly, because we're researchers, randomly select stream crossings to place in different categories of controls. Well, the controls would be up and down from the crossings, but expanded stream crossings, like I showed, culverts. You could have culverts with fences, culverts without fences, expanded stream crossings with fences and without fences. You can have different designs of stream crossings, different designs of culverts. But the main thing is that these have to be done, the thing has to be done as an experiment so that you can eliminate confounding possible explanations. So they need to be randomly or arbitrarily assigned, these treatments. And that's what makes it difficult, because you have to plan this thing when the road is being planned. These effects do not directly tell us which mechanism is responsible. And identifying that mechanism is important for designing effective mitigation. It seems at this point that road mortality has a larger effect. In general, broad sweeping statement across, all of vertebrates, that road mortality is more important than the movement barrier effect and the noise effect. So what that means is that the first priority of road mitigation should be to reduce roadkill. So we should be focusing on that if we're just starting out. If we've still got roadkill, we should be reducing roadkill. If we don't have any roadkill because we fenced the whole thing, or whatever we've done, then we can think about improving connectivity or reducing noise. But first we have to get rid of the roadkill. And I think there's one more here. Population level tests of mitigation effectiveness are urgently needed. These are long-term projects and that require a lot of collaboration with transportation agencies, but I think they're really needed because it's the transportation agencies that want always to know the answer. How should we do this? And we can't really say if they work unless we do an experiment to see if they do. Thank you very much.
First question. Are you aware of any road that has been entirely fenced? Did it work for reducing mobility?
So I'll repeat the question in case. So the question was, has there ever been a road that was entirely fenced, and did it work for reducing mortality? the best example, I think, is the highway in Florida. It's called Alligator Alley. It's Highway 75, I think. It goes right across the peninsula. So you have Florida, like this. It goes right across near the southern part of Florida. And it was built at a time when there was a lot of concern, there still is, but when there was a lot of concern about the Florida panther, which is an endangered subspecies. So it comes under legislation in the United States. So they had to build this road. If they wanted to build the road, they had to build it to eliminate, I guess, the impact of the road on the Florida panther. So it's quite astounding to drive down this road because it has panther-proof fences all along the road. It's probably about maybe 80 kilometers long. And it's panther-proof means very, very high because panther is a big cat. So it has very high fencing all the way along. And there's never been, I don't believe there's ever been any panther mortality on that road. It also has underpasses. So is it a clear test of the mortality hypothesis? Well, it has both. It has Florida, it has panther underpasses, and fencing. But I'm pretty sure that it's the fences that have kept the panthers from dying on this road. Another example is not a fencing example, but there is an example of, also in Florida, of a road with the lip that I showed. And they put that lip there because this was a commuter road, so people drove on this road back and forth to work. And a lot of animals, especially turtles and frogs, were getting killed on this road. And once they rebuilt it with that lip, the mortality disappeared. So, I don't know. So while I'm talking about that, I also remember going to an ICOET meeting a long time ago, and there was a lady there from Poland who said that all the main roads in Poland are fenced. And that's because hunting is so important in Poland. And the hunters are a very big lobby. They're a very important part of the population, and they would not allow roads to go in without having fencing. So Poland would be a good place to look at the effects of fencing, I think. Okay, so this is a question from someone who has read the literature. So the question talks about 3 types of avoidance. There's avoidance of the road. So the animal comes to the road, doesn't like to go there, and turns away. It's often for species that don't like to go in the open, for forest species, for example, and also that want to have some kind of vegetation. So they don't like the surface of the road. That's what we think is the case for small mammals. The second one is car avoidance. So that's a species like a human being who looks for a car. And if there's no car, then tries to cross the road. So if they see a car coming, they back off. That's car avoidance. So, and then there's noise avoidance, and that's where the animal is approaching the road, but at a distance from the road, can hear the traffic, and doesn't like that, so turns around. So the animal with noise avoidance will not even get close to the road. Or it depends on the traffic volume, of course. It depends on the noise. So now the question is, how do we distinguish between noise avoidance and... Yeah, well, okay, so that's the 3 types of avoidance. Yeah, and then there was a reference to a paper, which is actually Andreas Seiler's work, who looked at the effect of traffic volume on mortality of ungulates. And what he found was that there's a maximum. So with low traffic actually it was speed. But there's a correlation between speed and volume. So with low traffic speed, you get lower mortality of the animals. And with high traffic speed, you get very high traffic speed, you get lower mortality of the animals. But with an intermediate traffic speed, you get the maximum mortality. So I guess the question is, does that tell us anything about the particular avoidance behavior, or even if it is avoidance or not? So this is tricky because it could be that at the high level, where you have high traffic speed, where you also probably have high traffic volume, that you have a reduction in the population from mortality, past mortality. So now when you look, you have lower mortality because the population is lower. So it's not even necessarily avoidance, that pattern. The low mortality at low traffic speeds could be because of low traffic volume. So not necessarily, it's just chance, there's just lower volume. It could be because at a lower speed, the drivers can better avoid the ungulates. Or it could be because at a lower speed, the ungulates can better avoid the drivers. So there's a lot of possible ways to interpret that curve. That's, I don't know, that was in Portuguese, so I don't know if you want to say it. Okay, all right.
There's a lot of people question about fencing and how it works to barrier effect, and aware about the maintenance spaces. And here in Brazil, maybe we have problems with spaces and maintenance of the spaces. And only fences may cause barrier effect more than in how to avoid this effect, secondary effect, but still effect.
So the question, I think there's a couple of questions, but it's to do with fencing and the fact that when you put fences in, you get a barrier effect. So what I'm saying is that initially, it's more important to avoid the mortality than to worry about the barrier effect. However, there is a barrier effect, and in some situations, it's more problematic than others. For example, if the road goes along a waterway, and animals are crossing the road back and forth to get between the water source and, say, a breeding ground, then you need to allow them to get across, right? Because then you're having a problem of access of the resources. But the thing is, if you put a road there with only an underpass and no fencing, you're going to have a lot of mortality, and that will have a bigger effect on the population. So it has to survive to get to the other side, to use the water first, right? So it's first important, so it has to do with priorities. So if you have all the money in the world, then you do everything, right? But the question is, how do you prioritize? And what I'm suggesting is we should start by worrying about the mortality in most cases. There was another piece to that question.
About spaces in maintenance.
Maintenance, I know.
Fences.
Yeah, I know. It's not, so the point was that in Brazil it's very expensive to maintain fencing. It's maybe even worse in Canada, because in Canada we have snow clearing equipment. And no matter what solution we propose, they always say, but we can't do that because we have to be able to drive our snow clearing equipment. So, you know, I think everybody has issues, and if it's just one of these things, it's expensive, and it's a question of priorities and values in society. Also, it's much cheaper to install all of this stuff when you're building the road. It's much more expensive afterwards and harder to convince people to do it when the road is already in place. So that's probably a trade-off. With my suggestion about the culverts, making them into those larger passages with streams and stream banks. I think that would be feasible if the standard for replacing culverts when they fail was changed. So you leave all the culverts out there the way they are, but when you replace a culvert, you replace it with something better. So you replace it by putting the stream back in. Okay, so this question says, how can we disentangle the effects of habitat amount, fragmentation, and matrix type of road effects on road kills? So, this is the type of problem that we deal with a lot in my lab. And what we do is we do this type of study by selecting, non-randomly selecting landscapes to study them. So, if you have three things, here we have habitat amount, we have fragmentation, and we have matrix type. Then we have a couple of categories, low and high categories of each, habitat amount, low and high, fragmentation, low and high, and then matrix type, let's say 2 types of matrix. And then we try to find landscapes, replicate landscapes, that represent each combination of those things. So we would have 8 combinations. So say we want 5 landscapes replicates of each, we would have 45 times 8, 40 landscapes. Easy, yeah. And then, if we want to know the effect on road kills, we would have to go and study road kills on the roads in each of those combinations. So it just takes a lot of students. So the question is, are there any mammals or reptiles that use culverts to cross roads? There are lots and lots of photographs of mammals and snakes. I don't know about, yeah, and probably turtles as well, showing them in culverts of different designs. But again, whether or not this actually has any effect on the population, like improving the effect of the road on the population, that's the thing that has not been studied. There was one study of a road with an underpass, I think in California. They looked at the road kills of, I can't remember, it was a larger mammal, and they looked at that before and after this underpass was put in place, and they had certain number of road kills before. They had photographs of animals going under the underpass, and then they had the road kills after, and it was the same number. They had just as many road kills after. So even though the animals were using the underpass, the number of animals getting killed was still the same. So why is that? I don't know. Maybe the underpass encouraged some animals who never would have tried to cross the road to go under the road. So those aren't the animals that get killed, right? Because they weren't going to try to cross the road in the first place. I don't know. Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure I completely understand this question. So it's about the effect of the roads on the vegetation, especially I think on the forest edge. So when you put a road through forest, you create an edge, and forest edges are not the same as forest interiors, right? The vegetation is different at the edge than in the interior. So this is about using GIS to, I guess, map the fragmentation of forest by the roads and to estimate the total effect on the edge. But the question is actually about the scale, and I'm not sure exactly what the question is, but it's something that, I guess, something about the width of the effect, or I'm not sure. But
let me know if
can you read?
Quem fez a pergunta sobre fragmentação da floresta e o efeito na rodovia? Partiu? effect on frogs, about the noise effect on frogs. There's no effect was found, right? Then the question is, this species is more common or is a sensible species? Okay.
So this was related to the road work that my student did looking at the effect of noise on frogs, on their ability to attract mates. And the question is are these common species or rare species? They're all species that are affected by roads. We only have 10 species of frogs in our area, which I say only because here you probably have thousands. So there are species whose populations are affected by roads, and our hypothesis is that there are many places in nature that are quite noisy already for frogs. For example, next to waterfalls or rapids, also in locations where you have a lot of other frogs calling at the same time. So I think it's just a flexibility that frogs have in their calling, that they can adjust to the noise, to the ambient noise. With the toad which did not change its call, it has an extremely, extremely high frequency noise. It's very loud and it carries over everything else. So they don't need to adjust their call because you can hear it almost no matter what. So I think, I don't know if that's the question.
There's another one about passages and fences. When you have under passages or over passages, the fences are along all roads or only to direct the movements?
So this is another question about fences and underpasses. So the question is, when we have an underpass or an overpass, should we have fencing just to direct animals there, just nearby the underpass, or should we have it along the whole road? So if you start with my point that mortality is the main effect, then what I would say is you shouldn't put the underpass or overpass until you fence the whole road. So by definition, when you put the underpass in, you have the whole road fenced already. So, or you could think of it the other way around. If you're going to put an underpass or an overpass in, you should fence the road too. So it says, in a highly fragmented landscape, such as the Mata Atlantica, where maintenance of some species is only possible in metapopulations, wouldn't fencing roads have a negative long-term effect on the survival of these species? No. It would actually have a positive long-term effect because you would reduce the mortality that these species are suffering from trying to cross the roads that are in between the patches that they're trying to get between. So if this is an endangered species that's barely existing in a metapopulation, what we should do is have fencing and some passages to allow it to recolonize. If the chance of a local extinction, if it's really a metapopulation, that means that local extinctions are happening fairly frequently. So that means we need to have recolonization of those populations. So we need to have some movement for sure. But in the short term and the medium term and even the long term, we need to not have the mortality. That's more important actually than that movement. But of course, we need both. If it's a metapopulation that's barely surviving because of local extinctions, then we have to have movement. But we also have to get rid of that mortality. Okay. So you explained, well this is okay, you explained the difference between car avoidance and road avoidance. Is it possible to measure those two effects? So thinking about measuring car avoidance, that's very difficult. Because I don't know about here, but when I put a proposal in, to be funded for research, there can't be any chance, or almost no chance, that an animal gets killed. So if I want to measure car avoidance, what I would like to do, well, I wouldn't like to do it, but what I could do is put the animal on the road and see if it drive at it and see if it avoids the car, right? That's car avoidance. But of course, that's very hard to study. So we don't really have good data, I don't think, on really probably any species. We know that frogs and I think snakes definitely do not avoid cars, because what they do is they stop. So when they feel the vibration of a car coming or they see the lights, they just stop. So that doesn't help, really. So they don't have car avoidance, but to actually see a species that has car avoidance, it's kind of tricky to do that. I had a hypothesis one time that still is left to be tested, comparing different insects, because nobody cares if we kill insects. So if we, the hypothesis is that for insects that are like moths or butterflies, when you drive along, they flow away from the car. So they're not avoiding the car themselves, but their flight behavior allows them to avoid the car. And you could compare that with species like bees or dragonflies that have a big, heavy body, and when they come in across the road, you end up killing them. So we should expect that the road effects on the population should be less for the moths and butterflies, the species whose flight allows them to avoid the cars, than for the species that don't. That's not what, of course, everybody cares about vertebrates, so it doesn't quite get there, but it's the closest I can come up with. We haven't done that yet, that comparison. So this is about explaining the wildlife crossing program in Banff, which is in the west of Canada. And it's about at least maybe nearly 3,000 kilometers from where I live. So I'm not intimately involved with the Banff project. I know that the thing with the Banff project, so for those of you who haven't heard of this project, it's a long-term road mitigation that's been going on for at least 20 years. And it is in a national park. That's the most important thing to know about it. Because in a national park, you have the mandate of the park, which has some weight. And so you have the national park, which has as its part of its mandate to maintain biodiversity. So we have through Banff the Trans-Canada Highway. That's the main highway that goes right across Canada. So that is a highway with big trucks, lots of cars. It's a very, very big highway that goes right across Canada, and it goes straight through this national park. So a few years ago, when they wanted to enlarge the highway, make it into 4 lanes, it was only 2 lanes for a long time, they had a lot of resistance, because from the park, but also from a lot of environmentalists and so on, because it's in a park. And so the park did listen, and eventually, I think there was a lot of, they didn't want to listen, but eventually they did listen to arguments from, especially, some of you have probably heard of Tony Clevenger, who's really been working on this for 20 years. And they put in overpasses, but they also put fencing. They did a lot of fencing. And at one point they talked about fencing. So there are also towns, essentially in the park, but they're not part of the park. And they talked about fencing off the towns, because you're in a park. So rather than fencing the road, fence the town. They didn't do that, they actually fenced the road. But they've been doing this in stages. So each time they upgrade another section of the road, then they have a whole discussion about what to put in place, what fencing to put in place, what underpasses and overpasses to put in place. And they've done a fair bit of monitoring of those. And one good thing that has been done that Tony Clevenger really pushed, is that they actually compare crossing rates and mortality rates where the fencing is and where it isn't, and where the crossings are and where they're not, so that you actually have a comparison at least, rather than just photographing animals in crossings.
When you talk about road mortality, what level of road mortality should we be concerned? Because there is different levels of road mortality. Some species that are not threatened and have a high road mortality should be concerned. Threatened species, it's difficult when we have to apply mitigation measures based on road mortality. In which level we think, or what we should do before apply mitigation measures and before to be concerned about road mortality in some species.
So there's a couple of aspects to that. One is, I think the reason that I've been interested in trying to document the population level effects of roads is because before you worry about mitigating the road, you should know that there are effects. So now we know that there are effects, and we're narrowing down to the groups of species that are most affected. So once we know that there are effects, and we make a decision that we want to mitigate, then it almost doesn't matter what the mortality level is, because we know that there's an effect, and we know that we want to mitigate, so we have to keep them off the roads. So it makes it more simple. You don't have to get that detailed estimate of mortality and what mortality level and all that kind of thing. There was another, oh yeah, and then the other thing is that, we talked about this a little bit last night, that in some ways it's better to think about this in terms of groups of species, because for one thing, the effects that we find stronger effects when we look at species richness, so the number of species or total abundance. Individual species, if you have an endangered species like the Florida panther, and you know every animal has a radial collar and you know how it died, then fine, you can show that it's roads, but usually you don't have that level of information. So we should probably be mitigating rather for one species at a time, we should be mitigating for groups of species. So we should come up with ways of keeping amphibians and reptiles off the roads, mammals off the roads. So,
Thank you, Lenore.